Okay, I'm going to try again. This is about the third or fourth time we've done this video. Plan is to try and put some videos up to help people revise. Trying to go back into things I think you'll have covered in year 10. So, nice gory topic to start with is about cholera, which spans, quite a bit into like the later stages of the medicine paper, which will be your paper 1. First question you should probably be asking yourselves is, what is cholera? It was known as King Cholera, perhaps in some ways unfairly, but it shows you the fear that people had of this illness at this time. It was basically severe, watery diarrhea, vomiting, sweating, leg cramps, sometimes cramping in other places. All of that could, be flu-like symptoms today. Also, victims were said to have had skin taken on a bluish grey tone at some points. The illness came around, we now know, by eating food or drinking water contaminated with a bacteria that was called Vibrio cholerae. Approximately today, cholera is still there. Approximately there's 150,000 cases worldwide currently still, and that is in areas where you will have poor sanitation, crowding, war, famine. Cholera is prevalent in areas which have that. Okay, so where did cholera first come to Britain? Well, it first came to Britain in 1831, and where was just up the road from us in Sunderland. Sunderland was very, very famous. Now it's a city, but then it was a town as a port. It brought sailors in and out of England. It was one of the areas which had this facility, and the big problem really was, the story says, that the Port Authority ignored a government order, which was to quarantine any ships coming into Britain from the Baltic area of Europe. They ignored it, they didn't go by the instructions they were given, and cholera came in via Sunderland, and it spread north into Scotland and south into London, and 52,000 deaths would occur in Britain because of this. Was cholera unknown to doctors at this time? No, it wasn't. It came around in Bengal, and doctors were aware of what cholera did in Europe as time passed. So it got into the Russian areas, the Baltic areas, but nobody at this point knew how to stop spreading cholera, because the germ theory was not discovered at this point. So nobody knew how to treat it. The two popular theories that were going around at that time: one, doctors thought, it's spread by touch, so we'll isolate any patients. Two, it goes back to bad air, miasma, and that's spread by that is bad smells, bad air, poisonous miasma. It originally was blamed on dirt in some areas, but this then transfers to smell, to match theories at the time. And what you saw very common was lime washing of houses ordered, barrels of tar and vinegar burned in the streets to try and get rid of the bad smells, the bad air, the miasma. So when the disease did reappear in 1848, doctors really didn't know what to do. British soldiers had noticed it in 1817. It did spread through Russia and the Baltic area by about 1823. Reports were in the press in St. Petersburg in Russia, so the newspapers carried reports of the disease being there. So this order which I mentioned before, ships from the Baltic would be quarantined. It did spread, as I've said, from Scotland to Scotland and south into London. It arrived in East London in 1832. It would cause about 800 deaths in the East End. Again, crowded area, poor sanitation, and at the time you didn't just have cholera, you had TB, tuberculosis, and TB actually was the bigger killer, it was the bigger threat at this time, but cholera had the reputation, it caused the fear, and therefore it caused the response. It really shouldn't have been a killer disease. I mean, like when we read the symptoms off there, killer illness, sorry, it shouldn't have been this killer. When we looked at the symptoms, a lot of them were similar to flu, but like we're looking at in this period, instead of replacing, like if you had diarrhea or sickness now, you would look at getting electrolytes and salts and fluids back into your system. Back then, doctors thought the opposite: restrict fluids, give purgatives, even bleeding the sufferers, so weakening them further. We know the first death in England of cholera was John James, 2 days after he left the Elizabeth ship in Sunderland on the 11th of February 1832. The Sunderland area tried to treat cholera. There was a code of sanitation which was drawn up by the Board of Health, but it was just dismissed. It was seen as unnecessary, it was seen as meddling, and Sunderland was like many towns at this time where there was no regulation on the housing. The water supply was poor, there was no regulation of what to do with sewage. So really what you've got is you've got an area with poor sanitation, and a lot of houses together. So it's perfect for cholera. The businessmen of the area actually was said to oppose the quarantine actions because they felt it would hurt trade. So they didn't want that to happen. So money was even talking back then, and there was an anti-cholera party formed of local businessmen and citizens of the area trying to discredit the cholera talk. So trying to help themselves, line their pockets, thinking about the economy. In Sunderland itself, and I know this isn't in the exam book, but it's local and we can link into it. We had the two leading tacklers. We had a William Reed Clanny, and we also had an army doctor called James Kell, who was stationed in Sunderland, and he was the only one who actually seen the disease this in person. So as cholera cases were on the up, the board basically had to admit that Sunderland had cholera and cholera was a problem. So towns would start to boycott Sunderland as an area. So Kell put his barracks in quarantine. He found that nobody fell ill. By middle of November, the Bishop of Durham had ordered a day of fasting and prayer. So again, you can see even religion in the 1800s was playing a role in how to cure disease. But the sick refused to go to the hospitals due to fear of post-mortems and body snatching, which were around at that time. Clanny and Kell did supply quicklime free for a twice sweeping of the streets in Sunderland, and the poor were even given blankets handed to them. So you can see here how to treat cholera there was no idea really. Doctors from across the world actually arrived in the area as cholera tourists to watch what was happening and see how it was treated, what was going on. Just like Sunderland, London was badly prepared. Workhouses were obviously a feature of the 1800s, and crowded workhouses could have proved a disaster of that time period. So think of Oliver Twist, the scenes at the start of that. Lack of cooperation in London was also a big problem, with the different areas or parishes that London divided into only accepting responsibility to treat or deal with their own people if they got the illness. So the story was that a captain of a boat was brought ashore dying in Wapping, and he was left to die on the pier as nobody would accept him as their responsibility. There were cases in the Docklands of medical staff having to be taken aboard a vessel, a ship that is, where medical staff on board refused to treat sufferers. Bodies from a ship called the Dover were found basically trouble where they were going to be buried. The idea was Poplar was the area that was closest to the ship, but basically there was people saying the bodies should be buried further south by a convict cemetery in Cholera. So what you've got is you've got the bodies spending a week on a ship first. So you can see really how disorganised, and even in those days, issues of bureaucracy really, and local government affecting effective cures. By 1848, the same problems are gone, probably the higher death rate's gone, but the mood is different. Previously there was almost like a boredom in medical journals, and obviously medical journals were used for sharing good practice and good ideas. The attitude would change of this in 1847 because Irish people had been starving. They start moving to cities, they bring typhus with them, public health reports, pamphlets and the like, and you see a more educated view coming out and a greater public reaction surrounding public health problems and the miasma issues. So doctors now knew cholera was there was less confusion, and you basically you start to see doctors looking into it in a lot more detail. And with the railway networks that have been set up, the checks with doctors could be made a lot quicker than they had been in 1832. Um, Journals were shared across Europe, information was exchanged. So cholera and other illnesses, you see the medical profession almost uniting. Um, Also in 1848, you've got hospitals have medical schools, and in the 1830s, medical societies had formed, which allowed more research. So London also had better medical and scientific resources and access to improved investigation of this illness and other illnesses. Um, and basically, you start to see stats and figures backing up theories. And this is going to become important. So you're looking at geographical areas, stats of people dying and linking them to bad smells. So at this point, miasma is still going, but the disease of cholera kept going in the 1840s, 1850s, and 1860s, where it's not an epidemic, but it's there enough to make people basically keep researching and keep looking into what's going on. Um, so that would bring in basically a doctor called John Snow, who I'll go into more in a future video. But Snow he was actually based in the Newcastle area when cholera arrived in the country, and he had a theory that it was not miasma. And he's, like when we're talking about use of statistics and plotting of areas, he looked at the Soho area where he was a doctor when cholera returned, and he basically used stats of where cholera outbreaks were, and looked at basically the area of Soho, which was heavily affected, which he was the doctor in, and he linked the cholera cases around a water pump in what was Broad Street, now known as Broadwick Street, and basically he had the handle of the pump removed, and cholera in the area diminished. So hence what I said at the start, spread by poor water supply. It was thought that a baby's nappy, which was infected with cholera, had made its way into the water supply and therefore infected anyone who was drinking from this tap. Also, strangely enough, there was a local brewery in the area at the time, and people who were at the brewery would rather drink beer, ale, than the water from the pump, and they didn't get ill. So it supports this theory. But Snow's theory itself wasn't accepted properly until the 1860s, but we'll look at that more in a future video. So thanks for watching.